Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The basic facts about Syria are as simple as the situation there is not. Syria borders Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, as well as here in Israel. It is of major strategic importance for Russia. For the last 54 years, the Syrian regime was held by the Assad family, but since 2011, the country has been torn by civil war, rebel groups of various affiliations, and competing outside forces. Against this backdrop, the rapid collapse of Assad's army once the northeast front was suddenly awakened last week and around Aleppo has once again showed the fragility of the Damascus regime and impacts other pieces in the regional puzzle from Ankara to Beirut and from Jerusalem to Tehran to Moscow. To capture this dynamic development, let's turn to Central Israel, where we're joined by Brigadier General in Reserve Yossi Kuperwasser, who formerly served as the Director General of the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, the head of the Research and Assessment Unit or Division at the IDF Intelligence Directorate, and currently he is the Project Director on Middle East Developments at the Jerusalem Center for Foreign Affairs these days, if I'm not mistaken. It's great to see you, General.
Great being with you.
Yes, sir. Turning now to the United States, where we're joined by Professor Russell Berman, who formerly served as a senior advisor at the foreign planning staff at the U.S. State Department. Currently, he is the director of the Middle East and Islamic World Working Group at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. It's a pleasure to see you, Russell.
Happy to be back, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure indeed. And with me here in the studio, our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, a dynamic and complex situation. The rebels have been speaking about initiating some sort of offensive now for a couple of weeks. Nevertheless, nobody took them really seriously.
Yes, it reminds one of what Hamas did on October the 7th. After a period of quiet, the bigger force, at least that was the feeling beforehand, became complacent and perhaps dormant, and the surprise attack succeeded. Now, imagine a notional president or prime minister, a very busy one, asking his national security staff to tell him in one paragraph or at most one page, who are the good guys here? Who are the bad guys? Are these terrorists? What's that HTS organization? They are no longer Al-Qaeda. They are no longer the offshoot of ISIS or the collaboration. Are we for a stabilized Syria with Assad in power? Do we want Syria to be split, to be divided into various provinces or cantons? So complicated.
Well, with regard to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, taking into account that the name Al-Qaeda is not the one designated but the people and their ideology is, I am pretty certain that al-Julani, who was second in command as a field commander under Ayman al-Zawahiri, who used to be, until he was killed in Afghanistan, for his leadership of Al-Qaeda, is a terrorist through and through, and his ideological aspirations are no less.
But is he better or worse than Bashar Assad? Or is it better for us, for Israel, for the West, that Assad remain in power?
Well, for that, we'll turn to wiser men than I. General Kuperwasser, I'd love to hear your insight.
Well, it's not easy to answer this tricky question. Both of them are dangerous people, and if they just could keep on fighting each other for the rest of their lives and keep us safe, that would be the best option, probably. The fact is that neither the United States nor Israel has a dog in this fight, and they don't want to intervene, and for good reasons. But if you ask me if we are forced to the corner and have to make a decision here, I would say that the opposition is not made only from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the terrorists of formerly Al-Qaeda. It's made of a wide array of groups Some of them are much less radical and dangerous than the HTS. And nobody knows who's going to have the upper hand in the end of this. I think that the most important thing that happened here, beyond the surprise, and we got used to countries being surprised by jihadists, it's the fact that unlike the situation until now, when everybody thought that there is some sort of a glass ceiling over Syria, makes sure that no side can decide a war against the other. And that's why Assad was ready to leave with the opposition centered in the Idlib province in the northwest of Syria. And the opposition lived with Assad then because they couldn't throw him away from power. Now it seems that there is a potential for a decision in this battle, because Iran became so weak, because Hezbollah doesn't have forces to spend on protecting Assad anymore, because Trump is coming in. Too many things have changed that Israel enjoys freedom of action in Syria against the Iranians. Too many things have changed so that we are fighting in a different context. And the fact that we have to make a decision whether we prefer this group or that group is an outcome of this new understanding that one of the sides can decide the war. And, I'm not sure that's going to happen, but it's a possibility, unlike what was the situation until now. And this has an impact on the way this war is being fought. Until now, it doesn't seem that the Syrian regime, with the support of the Russians and with the support of Iran, is able to stop the successes of the opposition. But this might change tomorrow morning. It's hard to say. Very unstable situation.
Well, like every war, this war also is very fluid, and we have to wait and see how the various tactical activities and the strategic backings and the constraints currently, with a lot of pressure being imposed both on Turkey on the one hand, where it is viewed as the orchestrator, the mastermind behind this entire onslaught, is going to affect its decision-making in the next several days, and whether or not it itself is also going to utilize the chaos in Syria to try and establish a buffer zone that was agreed upon in the Astana Triangle with the Russians, with the Iranians, to try and establish a buffer zone of a demilitarized area that is supposed to protect its southern border. But Professor Berman, I'd love to hear your take on this.
Well, Syria today is a textbook case of what Clausewitz called the fog of war. A kinetic action has begun, and we really can't predict what's going to happen. I guess I'd want to distinguish among different versions of your question, Jonathan. You asked who are we rooting for? What side are we on? Should Israel intervene? Absolutely not. Israel's pretty busy with many other things. Israel has an interest in Syria insofar as it would be desirable if Syria stopped to be a conduit of supply from Iran to Lebanon. Should the United States intervene? Well, that's certainly not going to happen in this lame duck era for President Biden, and President Trump is sure not to intervene. His inclinations are against intervention in general. It would be in the interest of the United States to see Iran and Russia weakened. Exactly what that means is unclear. What's going to happen on the ground, though? The forces of the opposition, Tahrir al-Shams, but also the Kurds have taken Aleppo, and I read maybe they've taken Hama, or they've gotten very close. Are they going to proceed any further? I don't know. I can't predict. There is an argument that the rapid collapse of the Syrian forces was not only a symptom of the fragility of the regime. No one likes Assad, not even his own army. But it may have also been a strategic move on the part of the Syrian regime to let the Kurds and the Islamists collide in Aleppo and Hama in the hope that they would start to fight with each other. There are some reports that there was fighting between the two sides, but it has been mitigated. So that strategy has not worked. The Jilani is a terrorist, as you pointed out, Jonathan. It's hard to imagine anybody worse than Assad. I mean, we should remember how many hundreds of thousands of Syrians he has on his conscience. What is it? 20, 30% of the Syrian population is displaced internally. This is a terrible person. This is a terrible regime. It should come to an end. But the question is, what would replace it?
Indeed. Well, Mr. Owen, when we're talking about the clashes, which is very interesting, what Professor Berman just mentioned, there are clashes between the YPG, the PYD, the various Kurdish forces with the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army, something that Turkey, when it orchestrated this various maneuver, it made sure that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham would remain on the right flank and that the Free Syrian Army, which is more loyal to Ankara than their jihadist fellows to the right, will establish a certain buffer with the YPG and not allow them to potentially also stab Turkey in the back, something that was relayed to me in Turkey when I tried to understand the complexities from Ankara's perspective. But how does the whole situation with Russia evolve here? Since right now there are reports that the Russians have withdrawn many of their naval vessels from the port of Tartus, a Soviet naval base, into the Eastern Mediterranean Sea to avoid a scenario in which any of their bases, be it Latakia in the northern part or Tartus in the southern part, will not be overtaken and the strategic assets with it. Is this a signal to the Assad regime that there is concern in Moscow that they may lose this war?
No, the Russians are not signaling, they are acting. And they are always acting in their own self-interest, much as they evacuated the families of their so-called experts in the Syrian military in early October of 1973, when they were afraid, and rightly so, that they will be hurt in a Syrian-Israeli clash. And indeed, several Syrians were killed and wounded later. And by the way, the image that I had in mind when I heard about this naval evacuation and the rapid advance of the rebels was of April 1975 in Saigon. The rapid collapse of the South Vietnamese army. And now we may see Russian helicopters flying into the Mediterranean with their panicked personnel leaving. And by the way, we didn't mention it before, but yesterday, and this was disclosed last night by the IDF, the Israeli Air Force, with very precise intelligence, by Yossi Kuperwasser's old colleagues, or perhaps new colleagues, took out the Hezbollah liaison officer to the Syrian army, a man named Jama, who apparently was a key liaison. And it shows both what you talked about earlier, the weakness of Hezbollah and the ability of Israel to insert itself in this seam between the various groups, because as we remember, when HTS was called Jabhat al-Nusra, Israel knew how to work vis-a-vis it in the same region of Golan where al-Jawlani took his nom de guerre from.
Indeed. Well, General Kuperwasser, I'd like to focus on Israel's red lines when we're talking about Syria, which will potentially force Israel to enter into the theater in one way or another. The first one is the Golan Heights, up to 60 kilometers demilitarized zones from any Iranian entrenchment, which is a vital point for the state of Israel. The second one is the transfer of munitions from Iraq through Syria into Lebanon. And we heard already IDF spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari coming out and stating clearly on Arab channels that in the event that the Iranians bring into the Syrian theater sophisticated weaponry, Israel will act to prevent that. What are we to take out of all that?
Well, I think from an Israeli point of view, the first goal is to make sure that those red lines are not crossed. And they are crossed all the time. So that's why we have to act all the time and carry out all kinds of military operations in Syrian territory. There is an ongoing effort by the Iranians together with Hezbollah to build the capability to hit Israel from Syrian territory, not only from the areas along the Golan Heights, but mainly from there. They have formed 2 units that are tasked with this mission. And let me remind you that just a couple of weeks ago, we picked a certain Syrian guy that was a part of this operation in the Golan Heights. And we, from time to time, carry out all kinds of incursions into Syrian territory in order to handle the threat that emanates from this effort. And the other threat that we are facing is that Syrian territory is being used for delivering arms from Iran to Hezbollah. And we have to realize that in the context of this new agreement that we have concluded, or arrangement, if it's not an agreement, that we have put in effect last week to put an end to the war between us and Hezbollah in Lebanon, one of the major issues is that Hezbollah is not going to be allowed to rearm itself, and that the Lebanese government should take the necessary steps in order to make sure that weapons do not come from Syria for Hezbollah in Lebanon. And that the way for us to make sure that this is being kept is to hit Syrian targets in Syria, and if necessary also in Lebanon, in order to prevent the shipment of arms to Hezbollah. And we are doing that. And the person that Jama, that Amir mentioned before, was in charge of all kinds of cooperation between the Syrians and the Hezbollah. And we have hit the unit that in Hezbollah that is responsible for these shipments, the unit 400, again and again and again and again. And the entire leadership was already eliminated. So yes, we are committed to those red lines, and we cannot trust Assad to provide us with guarantees that these red lines will not be crossed. That's why we cannot work with Assad. Not that Giuliani is much better, but Assad, we already know. Now we have to understand it's not only about Assad and Syria. It's once you take Assad away, the entire Iranian axis that is crumbling anyhow, the entire Iranian axis is falling apart, because you can't supply Hezbollah with weapons if you don't control Syria. And that's why it's so important for the Iranians to bring in troops from Iraq and from other places in order to support the falling and failing Assad regime. And I think that we should understand that the importance is beyond these red lines about what's going to happen from Syria. The importance is to make sure that we are fighting a war in order to remove the threat from the Iranian axis against Israel. And in this respect, the fall of Assad is going to be a major milestone in achieving this goal. So that's why I think that looking at the matter from various reasons, I wish that Assad will suffer more than the rebels. And I think it's also good for the people of Syria. They will have, maybe, that there is a chance, not a big one, but there's a small chance that this will enable the people of Syria to make their own decisions about how they want to live, and liberate them from this Assad regime that, as you said, is in power for 54 years.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, and also Professor Berman highlighted, the various groups, they're not all Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, they're not all Al-Qaeda affiliate. There are legitimate Syrian opposition forces that are operating within this context, backed by the Turkish government, of course, very interested in seeing the Turkish influence enter in the vacuum that emerged in light of the diminishing force of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the fact of the matter is, you're seeing operatives, terrorists from Ansar Allah, all the way from Yemen, Houthis coming to Syria. You're seeing small groups of Hezbollah not joining the fight in the front, but rather going to Hezbollah installations to try and protect their interests in Syria, alongside other Hashd al-Shabi organizations from a whole variety of militias within that umbrella organization coming in to support the Assad regime, is quite indicative of the dire distress of the Damascus regime and potentially the strategic interest, as you mentioned, of Iran to maintain its influence and push back on the Turkish effort to disrupt the Iranian strategic scheme. But Professor Berman, there have been also a couple of reports with regard to Central Command targeting Iranian proxies and interests in the vicinity of Al-Bukama, the Al-Mayadin area, particularly following repeated attacks by those Iranian proxies against various installations belonging to Operation Inherent Resolve, namely the U.S.-led coalition against the Islamic State. To what degree is the United States going to further escalate those activities in order to ensure force protection on the one hand, but also its own strategic interests on the other?
I'd be very surprised if the Biden administration were to escalate in any significant way. These attacks on on American interests in the region by various forces have not been met forcefully, only intermittently. The same holds actually for the response to the Houthis. It's possible that the lame duck era unleashes tendencies within the Biden administration to act more forcefully, but I would find that surprising. The big question, I believe, will be what happens when President Trump comes into office. You'll recall that President Trump at one point wanted to withdraw American forces from Syria, and he was convinced not to. But of course, the different Middle East at this point, the American interest, I believe, and presumably the Israeli interest as well, is not so much in yes or no to Assad. As I said before, Assad's terrible, may he burn in hell. But the real political decision, the real strategic decision is dismantling the axis of resistance, that is to say, dismantling Iranian power projection through the region. Assad is one piece of this, but this is not about regime change in Damascus. It's about degrading Iranian power throughout the region. And these could lead to two different, to many different outcomes. You pointed out correctly, Jonathan, that the opposition to Assad is heterogeneous. There are lots of different groups. I'd see this as an example of the fact that there are always ulterior motives. There are always ulterior goals and heterogeneous participants in a situation like this. But if Assad were to fall, and I don't think we're close to that, and if Giuliani or the opposition forces were to come into power, it's pretty clear that they would not be Iranian allies. Therefore, this would be a dismantling of the axis of resistance, and that's a good thing for the United States, a good thing for Israel, and frankly, a wonderful thing for the people of Syria, who have suffered more than anybody else under the violence of Assad and his allies in Hezbollah.
Indeed. Not to forget also that if you look at the whole line of the people who Trump appointed to different very important positions, on the one hand, you have Mike Waltz, the incoming national security advisor, currently still a representative, congressman, very pro-Kurdish, which is not necessarily good neither for Assad nor for Turkey. On the other hand, you have the incoming director of national intelligence, who is openly anti-Turkish and more inclined to be sympathetic to Russian interests at times, at least from what we hear, but nonetheless very vigorous in support of Israel and anti-Iranian interests. So it's going to be very interesting to see how they all work together on the different complexities at hand. Very short, Mr. Owen.
2 points. One, chemical weapons. We may still see some employment or the rebels getting hold of them, a very significant move if it happens. The other one, the Israeli-Syrian front, ANDOF, the UN disengagement of forces and observers, this is going to be renewed later this month. And if they could get more power, not UNIFIL in Lebanon, maybe it would help pacify this front.
15 seconds each. What should we focus on in this theater? General Kupelwasser, we'll start with you.
I think that we should focus on the capability of the opposition to maintain the momentum they've gained so far. If they manage to go south of Hama and cross Homs, that's going to be a major breakthrough and put the regime in danger.
Of course, if Homs falls, Damascus will be next in line. Professor Berman?
What you should be focusing on is not being too narrow. 7 weeks till President Trump comes into office. In the meantime, there may be significant changes in the Ukrainian war. I just read that martial law has been declared in South Korea, and the French government is very likely to fall. So 7 weeks from now, the world is going to look different than it does today.
Indeed. Well, I'd like to immediately thank General Kupelwasser, Professor Berman, Mr. Owen, for all of your insights, and I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition from here in Jerusalem. Shalom. For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.